Vice President JD Vance is now claiming that behind the scenes, European leaders are much more reasonable about Trump's desires to take over Greenland. Publicly, European leaders say that is definitely not the case. And behind what all these foreign heads of state are saying, there's another, much more likely reason why Trump and his allies are interested in Greenland so much. And of course, it has to do with billionaires wanting even more resources and even more money. So on Friday, The Independent reported that JD Vance says European allies are secretly behind Trump's desire to invade and take over Greenland. Vance was quoted as saying, "They've been incredibly hostile in public, and a lot of this is posturing, right? If you're a European leader, they have to seem like a tough guy against Donald J. Trump." So, a lot of this, what we've seen, is more symbolic posturing for the Europeans. Behind the scenes, they're much more reasonable. Vance went on to say that they've acknowledged that, God forbid, something significant happened in Greenland, the United States would have to play the leading role in defending it. So there's a broad recognition that much of what we said about Greenland is actually true. And it's interesting to juxtapose the public posturing with the very reasonable private negotiations that we've had with the Europeans. Now, to me, a lot of this basically sounds like gaslighting. Vance is claiming that in secret he has information that goes against what all of these other foreign leaders are saying publicly, when, first of all, we have no way to know the reality of these behind the scenes negotiations. And also, he may be exaggerating these European leaders trying to play nice with the Americans, since we have such a hostile and uncontrollable person in charge of our country right now. In contrast to what JD Vance is claiming, The Independent reported that French President Emmanuel Macron openly accused the US government of useless aggressivity over Greenland and railed against this new imperialism and colonialism. They reported that the president of the European Union's executive branch threatened an unflinching, united, and proportional retaliation against the US if it moved against Greenland, and that even British Prime Minister Keir Starmer warned that the UK will not yield to the US president. This is also in line with remarks reported by The Guardian from European Council President Antonio Costa, who said, "We believe that relationships between partners and allies should be managed in cordial and respectful ways. Europe and the United States have a shared interest in the security of the Arctic region, notably working through NATO." But then he said, "Denmark and Greenland have the full support of the European Union, a reflection of our firm commitment to the principles of international law, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty, which are essential for Europe and for the international community as a whole." Now, behind all of this official government language, there are a few interesting things happening here. The US is basically threatening that Russia and China may try to use these Arctic territories as a battleground in future conflicts, and that the US military would be necessary to protect Western nations from that conflict. But over the past few weeks, European Union nations have been sending troops to potentially mobilize in Greenland to show their own show of force against the US. At the exact same time, we've seen how Trump's international relations model is aggressive and destructive in other ways, like with the tariffs that he keeps placing on countries around the world, including in Europe. Euronews has reported that European leaders have vowed to hit back at the US if Trump goes ahead with these 10% tariffs he's threatened to force the sale of Greenland to the US. Denmark's prime minister said, "We can negotiate anything, but we cannot negotiate our very fundamental values, sovereignty, the identity of our countries and our borders. Basically," she said, "our democracy." Other European Union leaders have also pointed out that this war of aggression between European countries and the US might actually aid these common enemies in Russia and China by dividing our supposedly aligned forces. Another thing to point out is that people who live in Greenland, including the indigenous populations who have always controlled the territory even before European countries, they're not happy about this either. They don't want US ownership, and their voices matter just as much, if not more, than what these unified alliances are saying. But this isn't just about the threat from Russia and China. There is a different game at play here that's been underreported on in comparison to the back and forth between these world leaders. And that underreported game has everything to do with money. Forbes has reported on the billionaires who have bet big on Greenland after Trump first began expressing interest in the country. And some of these names are very familiar. Forbes reported that Ronald Lauder, the heir to the Estee Lauder fortune, is credited with giving Trump the idea of taking over Greenland in the first place during his first term. Ronald Lauder has since invested in a Greenlandic freshwater bottling company, which at this stage has been unprofitable. But considering that he was the one to put this idea in Trump's ear, it raises a lot of questions about political interference from big dollar donors. Then you have Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Michael Bloomberg, all of whom have invested in something called Cobalt Metals. That company has searched for valuable rare earth minerals used in electronic devices, the kind of products that these men have interests in through their own companies. The powerful venture capitalist Mark Andreessen has also invested in this search for rare earth minerals in Greenland. But we should note that Cobalt has denied this to Forbes, saying that they don't currently have any exploration claims in Greenland happening right now. Nonetheless, more and more people involved in the AI industry have set their sights on rare minerals around the world, including Sam Altman, CEO and founder of OpenAI, who similarly invested in Cobalt. Then you have billionaires like Peter Thiel. He's investing in something a little different, but nonetheless pretty disturbing. It's a startup that's interested in building these quote unquote technically advanced freedom cities in places like Greenland. But what these actually look like is little nation states under the control of billionaires whose populations are basically forced to create additional wealth and mine additional resources for their new leaders. It's like a dystopian sci fi concept that could become a reality if we're not careful. And finally, we have Howard Lutnick, Trump's own Secretary of Commerce, who served as the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, which has invested in Greenland mining. Again, this raises a lot of questions around conflicts of interests and how politics are being used to direct more money into these billionaires' accounts. But that's no surprise considering how corrupt Trump is and the fact that he made over $1 billion while president just last year alone. So when Trump says that his reasoning for wanting to take over Greenland is just based on national security, there's a more obvious reason behind that excuse as to why he might actually be setting his sights on the country now. And notably, what Trump is saying about Greenland and national security is reflected in Project 2025, that Heritage Foundation document that Trump claimed he had nothing to do with and wouldn't inform his presidency at all, but has nonetheless laid the foundation for tons of sweeping changes he's made in just the past year. Project 2025 says that NATO must acknowledge that it is in part an Arctic alliance. With the likely accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, every Arctic nation except for Russia will be a NATO member state. But the document also goes on to add that the North Star of US Arctic policy should remain national sovereignty, and that the US should unapologetically pursue American interests in the Arctic by promoting economic freedom in the region. That sounds like a lot of covert conservative policy speak for everyone should be able to make money off of this deal under the guise of protecting things like national security. Whether there are legitimate national security concerns or not also doesn't really matter when you consider that nobody in Greenland wants this and the country has its own sovereignty that the US should be respectful of. But in addition to all of these concerns, the way the US has gone about this, and Trump's administration in particular, has backfired in a lot of ways. Responsible Statecraft ran a feature on this man, Trump's man in Greenland, whose name is Thomas Stans. He's a MAGA policy influencer whose position has really risen under Trump's administration, but has nonetheless been pretty unsuccessful. But Responsible Statecraft goes on to note that Trump's policy on Greenland reveals some serious downsides of this approach, one being a profound lack of organization. In a normal policy process, officials from across the State Department and intelligence community would have the opportunity to coordinate on and critique such a consequential proposal. The process would be slow moving, which helps the administration prepare to defend these types of policies and their potential repercussions, like, say, the rapidly evolving trade war between the US and Europe that Trump kicked off with a tweet over the weekend. And while Trump is constantly using his personal social media channels to do things like this article was posted just a few days ago, so it is in relationship to what's been going on this weekend, including at Davos, the World Economic Forum conference. No matter what JD Vance says is happening behind the scenes, what we know to be true is that a group of oligarchs are using the Trump administration as their own personal policymaker in order to grow their wealth, expand their control over resources at the expense of everyday people around the world. What these oligarchs have in common is that they funded Trump, they invested early in Greenland, they want deregulation and weak sovereignty because they only benefit if Denmark and Greenland lose control. These oligarchs are essentially using Trump for their own agendas at the risk of democracy entirely. Yes, Trump and Vance are a laughingstock on the global stage, but there's a real danger behind their words and a real potential for these oligarchs to seize even more control if their desires to take over Greenland actually go through.